Some moments in life cling to us like shadows, silent, yet unrelenting, reminders of the things we wish we could forget but never truly can. They hide in the corners of our minds, emerging when we least expect them, forcing us to confront the fractures in our carefully constructed lives. For Sharon, a single day at the beach with her son, Daniel, was meant to be an escape from the loneliness that had long settled into her marriage. But what began as an ordinary outing soon spiraled into something far more complex. Something that would leave her questioning everything she thought she knew about love, longing, and the fine line between right and wrong. Now, 2 years later, she stands at the precipice of a truth too heavy to bear, trapped between the life she built and the one she can't seem to let go of. The sun blazed overhead, casting golden light across the sand and sea. It was the kind of day that should have felt carefree. The kind where laughter echoes against the waves and the weight of the world fades. But the heat pressed down heavily. Too warm. Too suffocating. Daniel and I laid out the towels in a quiet spot near the water. "Help me with the sunscreen," I asked, handing him the bottle as I settled onto the towel. He was 16 at the time, tall but still boyish in his frame. His brown eyes, the same as his father's, steady but distant. He nodded wordlessly and knelt beside me, the bottle cold against my sun-warmed skin as he squirted a bit onto his hands. At first, it felt innocent. His hands were tentative, unsure, gliding gently across my back as he applied the oil. I closed my eyes and let out a sigh, sinking into the sensation, grateful for a moment of peace after what felt like years of disconnection. It was such a simple thing, the touch of another human being, and yet it struck me how foreign it had become. Thomas used to touch me like this. Long ago. Back when our love felt like something alive rather than a duty we fulfilled. As Daniel's hands moved with growing confidence, I felt a pang of nostalgia. It reminded me of when he was little. His tiny hand clutching mine as we crossed the street. His trust in me unwavering. But then, slowly, something shifted. His hands lingered, sliding lower, and an unfamiliar tension coiled in the air. My breath hitched as I realized what was happening. The innocence of the moment warped, and a flood of confusion crashed over me. Why didn't I stop him? That question haunts me more than anything else. I've replayed it endlessly in my mind, searching for an answer that might justify my silence. But there is none. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, that he was just a boy helping his mother. But deep down, I knew the truth. I felt it in the pit of my stomach. A cold, nauseating certainty. And yet, I stayed still. My voice lost somewhere between disbelief and denial. That day changed everything. It shattered the carefully constructed illusion of my life and left me with questions I'm still too afraid to answer. 2 years later, I'm not sure who I am anymore. I've become a stranger to myself, haunted by the choices I made, or didn't make, and by the fractured pieces of the family we once were. Thomas and I had been married for over 15 years. To the outside world, we were the perfect couple, a beautiful home, well-mannered children, a life others envied. But perfection is often just a mask, hiding the cracks beneath. And our cracks ran deep. Thomas's job consumed him, leaving little room for anything else. Late nights at the office, missed dinners, and forgotten anniversaries became the norm. I used to tell myself it was for us, that his sacrifices were for the family. But as the years went by, that story stopped making sense. What's the point of a house if no one's in it? What's the point of love if it's never shown? When he was home, he barely looked at me. I had become invisible to him. A ghost inhabiting the same space. Our conversations were reduced to logistics, bills, groceries, schedules. Even with Daniel and Lisa, our younger daughter, his presence was fleeting. He loved them. I'm sure of that. But love needs more than words to survive. He was there. And yet he wasn't. I remember standing in the kitchen that morning, watching him rush out the door, briefcase in hand. He gave Lisa a quick kiss on the head and offered me a single, distracted glance. Sorry, Sharon. Something came up at work. I can't make it today, he said. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. It's fine, I replied, my voice tight. But it wasn't fine. It hadn't been fine for years. Still, I didn't argue. What was the point? Daniel didn't seem surprised when I told him it would just be the two of us. He shrugged, grabbed the bags, and followed me to the car. On the drive to the beach, he sat in the passenger seat, earbuds in, staring out the window. I glanced at him occasionally, struck by how much he had grown. 16 already. Where had the time gone? I worried that I was losing him, that he was slipping away into adulthood faster than I could keep up. But nothing could have prepared me for how much I would lose that day. I replay it over and over, wondering if I could have done something, anything, to change the outcome. I remember the sun on my skin, the sound of the waves, the weight of his hands on my back. I remember the way the air seemed to thicken, the way my heart pounded in my chest as realization dawned. And I remember the silence, the heavy, suffocating silence, as I said nothing, did nothing. Some moments haunt you for the rest of your life. They cling to you, reshaping who you are, leaving you to grapple with a version of yourself you no longer recognize. That day on the beach was one of those moments. And no matter how much time passes, it remains with me. A shadow I cannot escape. The words hung in the air, venomous and heavy. The moment I said them, regret clawed at me. I saw hesitation in his eyes, felt it in my chest. But Daniel didn't stop. His hands lingered, lower than they should have. And I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it all to vanish. My heartbeat roared in my ears. Could he hear it too? I wanted to tell him to stop, to push him away. But I couldn't. I let it happen. To this day, I don't know why. Maybe it was the crushing isolation. Maybe I'd stopped caring. Or maybe, in my desperation to feel seen, I told myself it didn't matter. That day on the beach broke something in me. It wasn't just guilt, it was a hollowing out of everything I thought I was. And yet, here I am, sharing this. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. It means more than you know. Your acknowledgement makes me feel less alone. So if you relate, please connect. It helps me continue. After that day, I noticed everything about Daniel. His gaze lingered too long, and I couldn't ignore it. It wasn't fleeting, it was deliberate, constant. I tried to act normal. I cooked, asked him about school, wore a smile that felt brittle. But the silence between us weighed heavy, and my thoughts screamed. That night, I folded laundry with trembling hands, replaying everything. His touch, His eyes. The tension in the air. I hated myself for not stopping him, for the part of me that wanted it. Thomas came home late. Exhausted as always. His kiss on my cheek was empty. A shadow of affection. Long day? I asked. Desperate to bridge the gap between us. He nodded. Already halfway to the couch. I was invisible to him. Lying in bed that night. Staring at the ceiling. I thought only of Daniel, his hands. His eyes. The way he made me feel. There was a dark, lonely part of me that clung to it. Even knowing it was wrong. Daniel's silence in the days after spoke louder than words. He didn't avoid me, he lingered. I'd catch him watching me as I cooked. Cleaned. Pretended life was normal. And I let him. I didn't stop him. Didn't stop myself. Late at night. Alone on the couch. His gaze would find me. I didn't move. I didn't tell him to leave. I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. And I wasn't sure I even wanted to try. The weekend arrived. And the house felt heavy with heat and silence. Thomas left for another last-minute shift. Leaving Daniel and me alone. Restless. I suggested we return to the beach. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I hoped the open air would ease the weight pressing on me. Or maybe I wanted to pretend nothing had changed. The drive there was quiet. But Daniel didn't wear his earbuds. Instead, he sat with his knee bouncing. His gaze fixed out the window. I wanted to speak. To break the silence. But the words lodged in my throat. It wasn't just silence between us, it was something else. Something I couldn't name. When we arrived, the beach was nearly empty. The ocean stretched out in endless shades of blue. The breeze brushing against my face. Daniel helped me set up. His actions careful and precise. I spread the towels. Trying to settle into the routine. This time, I didn't ask him to massage my back. I couldn't. Instead, I lay down. Closing my eyes. Feigning calm. But even with my eyes shut, I felt his gaze on me. Heavy and searching. Hours passed in a haze of sun and silence until we decided to rinse off at the beach showers before heading home. It was supposed to be quick. Just a practical way to wash off the sand. But when we got there, something shifted. Daniel stepped under the stream first, letting the water run down his back. The sunlight hit the droplets, turning them into tiny prisms of light. I stood frozen, watching him, unable to look away. There was something about the quiet confidence in his stance. Something that drew me in. Before I could stop myself, I stepped forward, stripping off my outerwear. I joined him under the cool stream of water. The chill bit at my skin. Yet it awakened something in me. I stood beside him, our shoulders almost brushing. The moment charged with an unspoken tension. I glanced at him. But his face was unreadable. His eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite grasp. The silence between us deepened. No longer empty but full of something electric. Something I didn't understand. For the first time in a long time, the world felt still. And the moment felt infinite. Whatever had shifted, I knew it had left its mark. Daniel looked at me. Startled. His eyes flickering with emotions I couldn't name. He didn't say a word. And the silence stretched between us like a thin thread ready to snap. I glanced at him. Then truly looked. My chest tightening under his gaze. Before I could stop myself, I blurted. You should take off your shorts too. You need to rinse properly. The words hung in the air. Reckless and daring. Even to my own ears. Why did I say it? Maybe to assert control. To test the limits of myself, or him. For a moment. He hesitated. And I thought he might resist. But then. Slowly. Deliberately. He slipped his shoes off. Followed by his shorts. My breath hitched. There we were. The sound of water pouring around us. Isolating us in a cocoon where nothing else mattered. The air between us grew heavy. Charged with something unspoken but impossible to ignore. I turned my back. My voice barely a whisper. Help me with my back. The words escaped before I could think them through. I heard him step closer. His hands finding my skin. Hesitant but careful. As if afraid to break me. His touch was steady. Almost tender. Yet every graze of his fingers sent a tremor through me. When his hands brushed my waist. I froze. The tension so thick it felt like the air had turned solid. I could have stopped it. I could have walked away. But instead, I leaned back. Closing the distance between us. Reaching for his hands. I guided them to my chest. My pulse hammering as I did. He didn't pull away. He didn't speak. In that moment, the floodgates opened. What followed was raw. Desperate. And overwhelming. It wasn't soft or tender, it was a collision of need. Loneliness. And something darker. When it ended, we stood in silence. The water cascading over us as if trying to erase the moment. But nothing could wash away what had just happened. I felt his arms wrap around me. Hesitant but firm. And I let him hold me. For the first time in years. I allowed myself to feel the comfort of someone else's touch. Afterward. We didn't speak. We dried off. Packed up. And walked to the car in wordless understanding. I stole glances at Daniel. His face flushed. His movements stiff. And I knew, everything had changed. We'd crossed a line. One that couldn't be uncrossed. And yet, despite the wrongness of it all, a part of me felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. That truth, however unbearable, lingered like the memory of his touch. The ride home was drenched in a silence so heavy. It felt as though the car itself carried the weight of the unspoken truths between us. The confined space seemed smaller than before. Its air thick and suffocating. Pressing down on my chest with each shallow breath. My fingers gripped the steering wheel like a lifeline. The knuckles blanching with effort. I forced my eyes to the road ahead. The rhythmic pattern of passing streetlights offering no solace to my spiraling thoughts. Daniel's presence beside me was inescapable. I could feel him, his proximity. His stillness. The subtle heat radiating from his body. His hands rested on his lap. Tense and motionless. As though he too was unsure of what to do with them. I stole fleeting glances at him. Unable to resist the magnetic pull. But his gaze remained fixed on the window. His expression a mask of restraint. His flushed cheeks betrayed him. Though, they spoke of turmoil. Of something simmering just beneath the surface. His jaw was set so tightly I wondered if he was holding back words or emotions too heavy to let loose. And then, breaking the oppressive quiet, his voice emerged. Low and unsteady. Almost as though he didn't trust it himself. "Mom," he said. The word heavy with layers of meaning I couldn't yet unpack. I didn't respond immediately. I couldn't. My hands tightened their grip on the wheel as if anchoring myself would somehow prepare me for what was coming. "What?" he continued. His tone tinged with a raw vulnerability that made my stomach twist. "What just happened back there?" The question hung in the air, echoing louder than his voice ever could. My heart stuttered, then raced, the sound of it thundering in my ears. For a brief, fleeting moment, I considered feigning ignorance, brushing his words aside with a nonchalant excuse. But the truth loomed too large, a shadow we could no longer ignore. Pretending, I realized, was no longer an option. Not after what we'd done. I inhaled deeply, my breath shaky and uneven, and whispered the only words that felt remotely honest. "I don't know." My voice cracked under the weight of the admission. It was the truth, or at least a sliver of it. I didn't know what had happened. I didn't know why. All I knew was that it had changed everything. The rest of the drive passed in a silence that felt both endless and immediate. Each second stretched taut like a string ready to snap. When we finally pulled into the driveway, I killed the engine but made no move to open the door. The night wrapped around us like a cloak, the quiet so profound it amplified the sound of our breathing. Neither of us spoke, but the tension between us was electric, a current humming in the stillness. It wasn't until Daniel turned to face me that I felt the full weight of what we had unleashed. His eyes, no longer guarded, met mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. There was something terrifying in his gaze, a longing so deep, so unrestrained. It left no room for doubt. "You've been feeling this way for how long?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper but carrying the force of a confession. The question hit me like a blow, unearthing feelings I hadn't dared to name. How long had it been? Days? Weeks? Years? The answer eluded me, buried beneath layers of denial and self-deception. "I'm not sure," I murmured, my voice trembling. "Maybe longer than I want to admit." His silence was louder than words. And for a moment, we simply stared at each other. Two people teetering on the edge of something we couldn't take back. When he leaned in, the world seemed to slow, every sound fading until all that remained was the pounding of my heart. His lips brushed against mine, tentative and hesitant, as though he was giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I kissed him back, the decision as instinctive as breathing. In that moment, everything else fell away. The years of neglect, the aching loneliness, the constant gnawing feeling of invisibility, all of it dissolved in the warmth of his touch. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt alive, seen, wanted. Somehow, we made it inside, though I couldn't recall the details of the journey. The walk from the car to the door was a blur, punctuated only by the sensation of his hand in mine and the unspoken understanding that passed between us. Once inside, the walls seemed to close in, intensifying the connection between us. Words felt unnecessary, almost intrusive. And so we remained silent, letting our actions speak in ways that language never could. The days that followed unfolded in a haze of stolen moments and quiet yearning. Daniel stayed close, his presence a constant reminder of the lines we had crossed. He found excuses to touch me, to brush against me in passing, his gaze lingering far longer than it should. Each time our eyes met, I saw a reflection of my own longing, a shared emptiness that bound us together in a way I couldn't explain. At night, I lay beside Thomas. His steady breathing a cruel reminder of the life I was meant to lead. Guilt coiled around my chest like a vice, tightening with every thought of Daniel in the next room. I told myself to stop, to end whatever this was before it consumed us both. But the resolve crumbled every time I saw him, his presence rekindling a spark I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know where we were headed or how this would end. But one thing was certain, we were no longer the same. Something had shifted, irrevocably. And there was no going back. Every day, the tension between us grew, creeping into every shared moment until it finally exploded one fateful evening. It was late. The house was silent. Lisa asleep. Thomas back at work. In the kitchen, I tried to focus on the dishes, but I could feel him behind me, watching, waiting. When I turned, I tried to stop him. Daniel. He didn't pause. His breath brushed my neck and he said, "I can't stop thinking about you." Mom. My heart pounded in my chest. I should have told him to leave, to go back to his room. Instead, I looked into his eyes and whispered what I shouldn't have. I can't stop either. And with that, everything shattered. Daniel kissed me, desperately, hungrily, and I kissed him back. It was wrong. But in that moment, I didn't care. I cared only for him. Daniel, my son. The only person who made me feel alive. Thomas. Our life. Our history, it all blurred into irrelevance. Since that day on the beach, things have never been the same. They never will be. We crossed a line I had sworn never to cross. A line I could never erase. What began as a fleeting moment spiraled into something uncontrollable. The guilt is suffocating, relentless. Yet it isn't enough to make me stop. The most terrifying thing, I don't want to stop. Even as I fear discovery, fear the consequences. I crave him. Every glance, every touch, every stolen second binds us deeper. I can't pull away. I won't. Because Daniel isn't just my son anymore. He's everything. Every day, I look at my daughter and my husband, Thomas, and wonder how they fail to notice the cracks forming in our family. Have I become that skilled at hiding them? Or are they simply too absorbed in their own worlds to see? Deep down, I know this fragile illusion won't last forever. The secrets I carry feel like a ticking bomb, threatening to destroy everything I've fought to protect. I've tried to resist, to remind myself of the consequences. But every time Daniel touches me or looks at me like I'm the only person in the world, I surrender a little more. He makes me feel something I haven't felt in years, perhaps ever. I know it's wrong. I know I should stop. But how do you walk away from something that feels so intoxicatingly real? The guilt is suffocating. Yet the desire is undeniable. I've built a life that should fulfill me. Yet I find myself craving something beyond it. I don't have the answers. I don't know how to fix this. Maybe there's a way out. A path I haven't considered yet. Perhaps you can see what I cannot, a way to escape before everything crumbles around me. The weight of our choices has a way of catching up with us, no matter how deeply we try to bury them. The secrets Sharon once thought she could control now loom over her like a storm, growing darker with each passing day. Daniel's presence, once a source of comfort, has become a constant reminder of the fragile line they've crossed, one that cannot be undone. She watches Thomas across the dinner table, his eyes dull with exhaustion, oblivious to the cracks widening beneath their feet. Lisa hums softly beside her, blissfully unaware of the chaos lurking just beneath their home's polished surface. And Sharon? She feels like a ghost, drifting through the remnants of a life that once felt whole. Late at night, when the house is silent and the weight of guilt becomes unbearable, she wonders if there's a way out. Could she find the strength to walk away? To reclaim the person she used to be before everything unraveled? Or has she gone too far, trapped in a web of choices that will inevitably consume her? No matter how much she tries to rationalize, the truth remains: love, when twisted by loneliness and desperation, becomes something unrecognizable. And some lines, once crossed, lead only to regret. To anyone standing at the edge of a mistake they cannot take back, know this: silence is not your salvation. Seeking help, no matter how terrifying it seems, is the only way forward. We are human, flawed and fragile, but we are never beyond redemption. The road to healing begins with honesty, first with yourself, then with those you trust. Mistakes do not define you, what you choose to do next does. Forgive yourself, but do not excuse yourself. Seek the light in places you once overlooked. And remember, even the darkest moments can lead to new beginnings, if only you dare to step away from the shadows. Thank you for being here, for listening to this story, and for taking a moment to reflect. If you found this journey thought-provoking, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss what's coming next. There's more to explore, more to uncover, and I can't wait to have you with me on this path forward.